So here's a quick thing you need to know if you're studying for your CIPS L4M7, that is level 4 module 7, whole life asset management. So there are three parts, okay, three main parts to this module, okay, and these are inventory, storage and movement, effective ways of controlling inventory, and then the whole concept of life cost, irrespective of whether you buy, hire or lease something. In a previous video, okay, which I'm actually linking, which I've linked in the video description, we talked about the first part, that is understanding methods of storage and movement of inventory. And that was divided into three learning outcomes, okay? And these were identifying the principle, purpose, and impact of stores and warehouse design, explain the use of product coding in inventory operations, as well as contrasting the impact of the use of different warehousing equipment. This is the second part, okay? Remember, three parts. So that former video was the first part. This is the second part of your level 4 module 7. And in this case, you're going to look at understanding the key elements of effective inventory control. Then again, remember, this is just a summary of everything you need to have at the tip of your, fingers as you proceed for your exams or as you, whatever. The point is, we are trying to summarize this to make it easier for you to, to understand these things. So in this case, okay, you first of all need to differentiate between the different classification of inventory, after which you'll have to identify the direct and indirect cost of holding inventory. And finally, you'll have to identify techniques associated with inventory control. So let's dive into that and see, talk about everything that you need to know as far as that is concerned. Okay, before we move on, I just want to quickly point out that if you are watching this and you haven't subscribed, kindly do, okay? Those numbers are important. I mean, they will help the channel grow and other things. Also, if you like this video at any given point, give it a thumbs up or leave a comment, okay, telling us what you'd like to, what kind of video you'd like us to do next and things of that nature. So let's move on. So the first learning outcome is differentiate between the different classification of inventory. And the first thing you need to know here is that there are a number of ways. There are many ways in which inventory can be classified. You're talking about open stock, work in progress, safety stock and finished goods, obsolescence and redundant stock, direct and indirect supplies, ABC classification of stock, okay, that too may apply, dependent demand and independent demand items of stock. And quite frankly, as a CIPS student, okay, as a CIPS student studying this module, you have to understand all of that stuff, okay? All those things we've just listed there, you need to know what they are and how they, how they actually work in practice, which is pretty much what we're going to talk about. So, if you're taking notes, just follow along. And let's start with the first one, opening stock. So when talking about opening stock, you're talking about the sort of stock that a business has at the beginning of their, business period, which could be the business year, the business cycle, whatever. The point is, if you're starting a business now, okay, and maybe your business cycle starts from, say, January to December, then what do you have at January? That becomes your opening stock. Now, don't confuse this with raw materials, because raw materials is just another way of classifying stocks, okay? So opening stock is not necessarily the same as raw materials. While raw materials could be opening stock, it's not the case that opening stock is always going to be raw materials. So don't confuse those two. The concepts of opening and closing stocks are essentially accounting concepts which are used to assess the quantity of inventory being held either as physical stock or in value at a given financial cycle. In fact, to understand that is a practical example. Let's say you're running a business and your year goes between January to December, right? And so at December, you have 10,000 worth of stock left. So what is going to be your opening stock? So assuming nothing else happens, it means that at January, you're going to have 10,000 as your opening stock. Remember, that was your closing stock in December, and that becomes your opening stock in January, okay? So the point is that opening stock is the sort of stock that you start with within that given, that given business cycle, okay? And so as you proceed, if you add any other stock, that is not just opening stock, that is just what you added to the stock that you started the business with. Determining how much inventory is held or the value of inventory held is referred to as stock taking. And that is something that you do at the beginning or at the end of the, the business period. So you always do stock taking to understand what you have, because you're probably running business thinking that you have things. Some of those stuff are obsolescent, some are redundant. That's the reason why it's important to do stock taking. Right. So here's a question for you. What are some of the reasons why stock taking is important in the organization? Yeah, that's a question. And speaking of questions that will help you pass your exam, if you're interested in computer-based, exam questions, okay, just head over to Zerite Network. I've added the link in the video description. And from there, you can go through a lot of practice exercises, right? Questions and answers. And as a bonus, you'll also have PDF summary, summarizing the learning outcomes and, the relevant questions that you can download to use offline. The point is, you'll test yourself, okay? You do the questions, get the answer. If you think you don't, if you don't like the results, you can retake the exams again. Link is in the video description, okay? So check that one out. And then, so let's move on. Raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods. So in business, you get inputs, which you process into outputs, okay? And that process is also going to involve a lot of stock. And so that is why we have raw materials as stock, we have work in progress as stock, and you also have finished goods as another way of classifying stock. Basically, the point here is to look at stock in terms of what is physically held and where it sits in the production process. So when we talk about raw materials, these are the sort of stock that can also be referred to as primary materials, okay? They are basic materials from which a product is made. For example, if you are making tables, then you're talking about things like timber and nails, okay? Now, in the production context, we also have secondary materials or secondary components, which are manufactured items bought in to include in a final product. So in a car manufacturing company, they don't make all the parts in-house. Some parts are bought from other companies and are just installed during production. So those are going to be the secondary components. The point to remember here is that production process is not a binary process, okay? It's not raw materials and then we have finished goods. In between raw materials and finished goods, we have something, and that thing is what we refer to as work in progress. So raw materials, finished goods, work in progress. In inventory management, work in progress relates to stock partway through a manufacturing process. And if you're thinking, okay, that is as far as manufacturing is concerned, but what if we are in the service business? What if you're providing services? Then where's the work in progress in this case? Well, in the service sector, work in progress is used to describe anything between an order and delivery. And so work in progress, finished goods, raw materials. So in conclusion, there are three ways to look at stock in relation to production process. So in this case, we have raw materials and components, work in progress, finished goods. Now, at this point, you should be in a position to remember a number of things. So at this point, you should be in a position to remember or to explain why it's important during the production process to consider inventory management. Number two, understand some factors that affect how much stock should be held at each stage of the production process. Also, don't forget, if you like more practice exercise, more computer-based exams, basically, okay? I'm not talking about just downloading questions and then, whatever. So the point is, things that you can actually do. Click on an answer, see if it's okay, go to the next question and all that. You can test yourself, right? So if you're interested in that, again, link is in the video description to, or you can just go to zeritnetwork.com. And from there, you'll be in a position to access those questions. Now, moving on. So the final thing that you need to know if you're looking at stock in relation to production. Remember, all this is just looking at stock in relation to production, okay? Opening stock, closing stock, raw materials, finished goods, work in progress, all that. It's just stock in terms of the production process. So the final way of looking at stock in terms of the production process is safety stock. This refers to stock held as a contingency or insurance against disruption or unexpected demand. So the idea is that you could have some stock that you have in place, just so if there is something wrong in the market, maybe there is a shortage or something along those lines, then it's like your backup stock, okay? So that is what safety stock is all about. stock that you're holding on to as as a backup stock or as a safety stock, as the name suggests. So right, is another question that you can try to see if you can find an answer to. What are the advantages and disadvantages of holding a large number of safety stock? Yep, so those are questions. Remember, it's learning by doing, man. So as you go through these, don't just look at those questions and be like, yeah, next video. It's like, look, why are you going through all these? Okay, you're revising, you're studying, you're learning. So test yourself. And again, as I said, if you really want to test yourself with proper questions, head over to the, there's a link in the video description that will help you that will aid you in accessing more of those computer-based exams. Now let's move on to the next thing, obsolescence and redundant stock. So at this point, I just want you to remember that there is a cost, okay? There is a cost associated with holding stock. The more stock you have, probably be like, yeah, now even if we run out of these things in the market, we have them, right? But there is a holding cost, okay? The storage, the guy who's taking care of those things, insurance, capital that is just tied up in those. So the point is, it's not always, it's a double-edged sort of sword thing, okay? Where you, on one hand, you think you're doing something, but then on the other hand, there is a cost to doing that. So the idea is that as you're doing that, you need to know which of this stock, okay, the stock that you're holding, which of those stock are obsolescent and which of those stocks are redundant. Okay, what is the difference between those two? Obsolescent stock is the kind of stock that is in good condition, but its demand is falling towards zero. So the point is, once that demand is zero, then nobody's going to buy that stuff. So you're just going to have it, but the customers are not interested in it. Okay? Which factors contribute to obsolescence stock? Well, some of those factors will include things like high demand for the product in the market, continuous improvement in manufacturing process, shifting consumer preference and technological advancement, effective inventory management. All the effective inventory management practices, all those are just things that you need to be in a position to explain. Okay? So for example, if you take any product, let's see which whatever. So something like phones, okay? So there's always a new phone coming out, which means at some point the old ones are just there. They're still functional, except nobody's interested in buying them. All right. So sometimes with improvement, stock just end up being obsolete, right? Redundant stock isn't the same as obsolete stock, okay? Redundant stock just refers to the stock that you have in excess. So it's not like if it's a stock that is people are no longer interested in. It's just stock that you have in excess, but there's a catch, okay? So redundant stock can be used because there's a potential demand for it. That's the catch, but just not for the current or intended user. Meaning what? Meaning, again, remember like the example I gave, okay, with mobile phones. So while people may not really be interested in buying the phone because there's a new version of it, you can still use it, okay? It can still be used as spare parts and things of those nature. But the problem is, it's not as valuable as it would have been, okay, had it not been redundant, okay? Now let's talk about the impact and cost of obsolescent and redundant stock. Okay, first of all, that is just something that you need to know. So we don't really need to talk a lot about it. It's part of your effort, right? So the point is that organizations need to avoid wasting storage space on things that are of limited or diminishing value, which is what redundant or obsolescent stock represents. You also need to understand causes of obsolescence, things like technology, cultural change, legislation. Causes of redundancy, okay, for instance, poor forecasting of demand, poor stock control. Ways of avoiding both redundancy and obsolescence are talking about things like good market knowledge, accurate forecasting, and things of that nature. Right, so you need to understand all that. Now let's move on to the next one. So another way of looking at stock or supplies is in terms of their function. And this is how you end up with direct and indirect supplies. So direct supplies are the supplies that are going to be integrated into the finished product. Again, remember things like raw materials, okay, that you process into the finished products. But then you also have indirect supplies, which in this case will refer to supplies that are not incorporated in the finished products, but which keep the business and the factory operating. It's sort of the difference between direct and indirect will depend on who's looking at it. It's obvious. Okay, the easiest way to understand this is to just think of everything that is happening in the factory, and then you say, okay, those are direct. And then in the office, indirect. But it's not necessarily the case, because you can still have supplies in the factory, in the production, in the assembly process that still end up not being direct. And yet they are part. Anyway, look at this example. So in a car assembly plant, for instance, you have components that go into the car. Okay, so these are the direct supplies since they form part of the finished good. So in this case, the car. Then you have tools and assembly robots, on the other hand, which are indirect supplies. And why is that? Well, simple. They don't form part of what is being sold. So most of the time, that's just how you look at it. But then again, the guy who's selling the tools, the assembling tools, the guy who's selling the robots, then, okay, to them, those are direct supplies because that is what they're making and they're selling. So again, as I said, it sort of just comes down to the person who's looking at it. But the simplest way to understand this is, if you have a product, all the components that are used to make that product, direct supplies. Okay? Everything else that helped in the process of making that product, which is not part of the product, cannot be traced in the product, becomes indirect supplies. Okay? That's the thing with direct and indirect. So let's talk about classifying stock in terms of cost. So in this case, we have ABC classification of stock. ABC is derived from the Pareto principle, which, well, the 80-20 rule, okay, which I'm probably hoping that you're familiar with. So the idea here is that you're going to classify stocks as A, B, and C. And then the difference between A, B, and C will depend on the value of the stock, okay, in short, the revenue the stock contributes, and yeah, well, that's going to, and the percentage of those stocks that you have. Basically, it's the percentage against the revenue those stocks are going to pretty much produce, or the value of the stock. So, okay, here's a simpler way to understand it. So under category A items, you have the smallest number of stock, usually about 20%, that will have a value of 80%. All right. So the point is that there's 20% of stock that gives you 80%, or that have 80% value. All right. So the smallest number of stock with the highest number of value, that becomes category A. For example, let's say you are dealing in cars, okay? So in a car assembly business, engines will fall under category A, okay? The car engine is obviously the engine, say gearbox. You're going to have a lot of those. They're probably going to be like 20%. And yet they cost more, okay? Compared to things like side mirrors and bolts, okay? And nuts. So the engines, you're going to have few of them. You're going to manage them carefully because their value is going to be very high. So those are category A items, okay? Where about 20% of those items give you 80% of the revenue. And then you have category B. Now, before you look at category B, here's just a quick question, okay? What are some measures that you can put in place to ensure that you effectively manage inventory that fall under category A in the ABC classification of stock? Again, that's a question. That's a practice question. I mean, remember, there are a lot of these questions. You can just access them using the link in the video description. So let's move on to category B. The items in this category make up about 30% of your stock and contribute about 15% of your revenue. Think of it this way. Remember, 20% of the stock, the item you add under category A contributed 80% of the revenue, right? Which means, what are you left with? 20%. Because 80 is already produced by category A, right? So it means category B and C will produce 20% combined. And you're already saying that category B is already producing 15%. And in this case, these are 30% of stock. So remember, 20 plus 30, that's 50. And then you already have 80 plus 15, which means now you're left with 5% revenue and 50% stock. Anyway, let's move on. So category B, right? 30% of these items which produce 15% revenue, right? And again, practical example, in case of the car assembly, this is where you have things like body panels and stuff of that nature. Now, don't get it wrong, okay? These things are still valuable. They're just not as valuable as category A item. So the idea here is that you're classifying stock in terms of value, okay? And revenue that they produce. So the percentage of those stock and the revenue the stock represents for your business. And then we have category C items. So this is where you have 50% of the remaining stock, which only produces 5% of revenue. They are still important. You're just going to pay more attention to them like category A or say category B, right? So in our case, the car assembly example, what do we have? In this case, we have things like bolts, nuts, fasteners, and other things that are used to hold the car together. Right, so when it comes to ABC, of course, there's some calculations which I've just not bothered with because, again, I mean, if you want a video on that, if you want a video showing how to do the actual calculation of ABC stock, just leave a comment in the video description, or you can put it up in any of our social media platforms. So that's Facebook, Twitter, X, okay? Whatever. The point is, if you want that, just comment below, and then, if you want a video showing how to actually do the ABC calculation. But just a quick one. So ABC, right? A, what do you have here? You have items, okay, 20% of your stock that will give you 80% of revenue. And then you have B. B, you have 30% of the stock that gives you 15% of the revenue. And then you have C, where you have 50% of the remaining stock, okay? So 50% stock that gives you 5% of the remaining revenue. That way you have 100% revenue and 100% stock. A, B, C. Again, if you have any question, as always, comment, okay? Don't sit there with your question and think, okay, yeah, just type it there, okay? Moving on, let's talk about dependent demand and independent demand items of stock. So the idea is in this case is to classify stock, okay? You're classifying stock according to how frequently they are needed. In this case, you have to be aware of stock turnover rates or stock turn. This is the frequency with which old stock needs to be replaced with new stock to ensure that the supply continues to flow out to the customer or to production. So this is how you end up with dependent and independent demand stock, okay? Here's the thing. You should be in a position to estimate customer demands so that you can know the number of products required. So the number of orders you get, as well as the past performance, will help you to know this, okay? Will help you to be in a position to answer the issue of how frequently these items are going to be needed. Now, some other things that you'll need to consider here will be things like seasonal factors, sales initiatives, and market condition. Dependent demand stock items are stock items whose demand will be directly affected by the demand of production. For example, raw materials used in producing those products. While independent demand stock items are stock items whose demand is not affected by the rate of production, for instance, office supplies. Okay, look, here's what I'm saying. You're producing something, okay? Let's say you're producing these batteries, right? So all the items, okay, all the stock that are directly involved in the production of these, or rather, all stock that are going to be whose demand is going to be affected by any change that comes out of this, change in price, change in people buying, then those ones are going to be dependent demand stock items. And then the other things that are not going to be affected by these, for example, the milk that is used to make tea for the executives or for the people in the production or in the assembly line, that has nothing to do with whatever you're producing here. So those ones just become independent, okay, demand stock items. So the question then is, how do you manage that? There is, knowing it is one thing, but then managing it is another, right? So how do you manage that? That is something you need to find out. So that concludes learning outcome 1. Remember, I said we have 3 learning outcomes. So what was learning outcome 1? In this case, you're looking at differentiating between different classifications of inventory. So that was learning outcome 1. The idea here was just for us to look at the various ways in which you can classify inventory, of which we've done. We've looked at opening stock, work in progress, safety stock, finished goods. We've looked at obsolescent and redundant stock. We've looked at direct and indirect supplies. We've also talked about ABC classification of stock, okay, as well as dependent demand and independent demand items of stock. So let's move on to the second learning outcome. So now the second learning outcome, the first learning outcome is just classifying stock, right? So the second learning outcome is designed to ensure that, in fact, the second learning outcome is identifying the direct and indirect cost of holding stock. So this section is designed to ensure that you're in a position to understand acquisition costs, holding cost, cost of stockouts, and the options to reduce cost while mitigating any negative impact on service level. So the idea is that while you might actually look at a physical stock, okay, and then quickly come up with the stock associated with those ones, there are still other hidden costs that you need to understand when it comes to holding stock. And these are things that you're going to look at. Now, let's start with the first one, acquisition cost. So you have to understand that the price of something is not the same as the actual cost of acquiring that thing. So the acquisition cost is more than just the price. Price is part of the cost of acquisition. That's the whole idea. In fact, it's a question, okay? What are some of the things that will form part of order cost? Okay? Like if you're ordering something, what are some of the things that will form part of that ordering cost? And in this case, we're talking about things like preparing the requisition. There's going to be a cost to that. Supplier selection and approval, okay? The cost of the ERP system time. Receiving and receipting the goods. I mean, all those are costs that are just associated with ordering something. So you see, it's not just the price alone. So you can look at these costs in three ways. Number one, we have preliminary costs, which are costs associated with actions before raising the purchase order. Placement cost, okay? The cost of raising the purchase order and ensuring that supplier receives it. So from the factory all the way to the supplier. Okay, if you're using a system, whatever, there's that cost. Number three, post-placement cost. That is the cost after the purchase order has been raised, necessary to get the goods to the requisitor and payment to the supplier. If that is complicated, just think that all these costs are going to be part of the P2P, basically the procure to pay cycle or model. Let's say you want to buy some construction items, okay? You just don't buy them from the first guy who shows up. You need to know the requirements, then request for quotation from the suppliers, which you will appraise and create a purchase order for, okay, for a suitable supplier. Once the goods have been received, you will have to ensure that they are what you wanted, okay, amongst other activities relating to receiving of goods, and then take care of the invoice. Finally, you have to make a report of the whole transaction. In all that, okay, all those steps, there's going to be a cost. So the procure to pay, okay, that entire thing. All these are just costs associated with acquisition, right? So let's move on to the second one, holding cost. So these are holding costs are costs associated with storage and handling. They can also be referred to as carrying costs, okay? Remember, when you receive goods, you're going to have to store them somewhere. So there are two different types of holding costs. Number one, cost related to the value of goods, for example, insurance on the product, loss due to accidental damage. And number two, costs related to the physical characteristics of the inventory, for example, the storage space, as well as movement equipment. I mean, you can add more to that list, but there is a thing with the holding cost. Now, the other cost that you need to understand is cost of stockouts, because there are moments when a business runs out of inventory, okay, inventory need. This is a stockout. Simply put, a situation where an inventory item is not available when required. So what do you think is going to happen if that happens? Okay, if you run out of stock? Well, there's going to be a knock-on effect all the way to the final product, to the consumer and all that, right? Meaning you will incur some cost, but which cost? Okay, things like loss of production output, cost associated with action required to deal with the stockout, for example, getting other suppliers or alternative deliveries, loss of market credibility, okay? Again, you can add more to that list, okay? So there are a lot of effects. So what are the effects, okay, that are likely to be felt if you run out of stock? That is pretty much the question there. Remember, just like holding costs, the cost of stockouts are often not visible and likely to be hidden in stores overhead and general production costs. So at this point, you need to be aware of acquisition costs, as well as holding costs, as well as cost of stockouts. So the question you need to find an answer to at this point is, what are the options to reduce cost while mitigating any negative impact on service levels? And the things that you need to have in mind, okay, so in this case, we're talking about things like use lead times and cost of holding as part of price evaluation, okay? Strategically place safety stock is something that you can use. Understand demands and seasonal or ad hoc fluctuations leading to more accurate forecasting. Again, using KPIs to improve supply performance and eliminate bottlenecks. Remember, just having that list is one thing, but then knowing how that works is something else. Right, that is actually the end of learning outcome 2. What was learning outcome 2 all about? In this case, the idea was for you to identify the direct and indirect cost of holding inventory. And that meant understanding acquisition cost, holding cost, cost of stockouts, okay, as well as options to reduce cost while mitigating any negative impact on service level. So again, remember, there are a lot of practice exercises, okay, practice exercises. We keep on improving on those ones that you can access through the link provided in the video description, or just go to our website. I mean, there are a lot of stuff there. You'll get some things you can download, okay? You have blogs that you can read, videos that you can watch, and all that stuff. Let's move on to the third learning outcome. So the third learning outcome is to identify techniques associated with inventory control. So at this point, you are in a position to, well, 1, okay, classify stocks. 2, identify costs that are directly and indirectly associated with holding the stock. But then the question then becomes, what are the techniques associated with inventory control? And that means, in this case rather, you need to be in a position to understand concepts like, or things like, subjective and objective forecasting, reorder quantities and levels, MRP and MRP II, ERP, just in time, okay, lean, as well as inventory performance measures. All those are techniques that you need to be aware of. At least you need to be in a position to say something about them, okay? So let's go over those ones, okay? Let's summarize the stuff that you need to understand as far as that stuff is concerned. So let's start with the first one, which is subjective and objective forecasting. So forecasting is a decision-making tool used by organizations to help in budgeting, planning, and estimating future growth. So the idea is to use the information that you already have, okay? So that you can predict what is likely to happen in future, right? So using what you have to predict what is going to happen in future. That's pretty much the point in forecasting. According to Lessons and Farrington, the following 6 questions should be used when forecasting. Number 1, what is the purpose of the forecast? Number 2, what is the time horizon? Okay. Number 3, what techniques are most appropriate? 4, on what data must the forecast be based on and how shall it be analyzed? 5, in what form shall the completed forecast be presented? And finally, how accurate is the forecast? So remember, the forecasting techniques can be subjective, okay? So they can be objective. If they are subjective, talk about qualitative. If they are objective, then you talk about quantitative. So let's start with the first one, subjective forecasting. So with subjective, okay, with subjective forecasting, you're using qualitative information to predict the future. These are information based on human opinions, insight, things like expert opinion, market research, surveys, okay. So the technique isn't exactly precise, but we use it because we don't have enough time, okay. We don't have time to either get the data or, well, the circumstances are such that you're not in a position to do a scientific sort of analysis of the thing. Imagine a company that is about to launch a product. The company has no sales figure or failure rate to use when trying to make any prediction about the product. So in this case, the company is going to rely on the subjective techniques, okay? Now, what about the objective techniques? So objective forecasting, which is also known as quantitative techniques, uses hard facts and data. So the idea is to eliminate the, human elements, feelings, and opinions in the equation, all right? And the following elements can be used to achieve these. So average, okay, the average, mean or median point of the observation. Trends, there is an increase or decrease in averages over time. Short-term cyclical movement as well as long-term cyclical movements. And with that, let's move on to the second thing, which in this case is reorder quantities and levels. So this technique is actually suitable when you're talking about independent demand stock items. Remember, we talked about those ones earlier when we were classifying stocks, okay? There are 3 widely expected reorder ways used for independent demand, and these are fixed quantities, economic order quantities, time or periodic review. So with fixed quantities, we're talking about a situation where you're just ordering the same thing, okay? Like if these are I'm ordering. So I'm just ordering the same thing, same quantity. So how do I manage this? Well, I can have a bin, okay, or a room where we put the stock there, and then from there we move it to the next room. So anytime this room is empty, I just know that's a signal. Stock should be there, all right? So that's one way to look at it. And with that in mind, you still need to know the other two. That is, what is economic order quantity, and what assumptions does this technique make? That is something that now you need to do on your own. Of course, it's not really that complicated. I'm just saying that because you also need to put in effort. Okay, remember, learning by doing. Right, let's move on to the next one. So we now have MRP and MRP II. Now remember, we pointed out earlier that there are stocks, okay, whose demand will vary as per the requirements of what we are producing. These are the dependent demand stock items, okay? And material requirement planning, or MRP, and its improved version called manufacturing resource planning, that is the MRP II, are techniques to go for. So these are computerized systems for inventory flows and inventory management. Now the system will use the following information to determine what inventory is needed and trigger orders or in-house production of such. So it will use non-demand, forecast demand, bill of materials for the final product, as well as inventory records. So the question at this point that you need to understand, okay, so the question at this point is, which are the situations MRP is suitable for? And in this case, we're talking about things like dependent demand items, situations where demand is not continuous. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a quick summary of that, okay? Now let's move on to the other technique or the other system that can be used when you're managing inventory. In this case, we're talking about enterprise resource planning, that is ERP. So enterprise resource planning is the latest development of MRP. So what exactly is ERP? This is a system for the coordination of planning and the execution of business on a wide basis in the supply chain. So the use of ERP goes beyond supply chain, okay? It goes to human resource department, who use it for recruitment planning, training, etc. In procurement and supply chain, it can be used for procure to pay, things like requisition to be paid, supplier invoice, okay, supplier performance measures. And here's the thing, it's something that you probably need to think about. So which other areas, okay, or rather think of it this way, how can we use ERP in the following areas, okay? So in areas like logistics and inventory management, finance, manufacturing, project management. I mean, think about it. How can we use enterprise resource planning, ERP, in those areas? And so once you've known that, you also need to know the advantage and disadvantages of ERP. So with advantage, you're talking about things like improved customer service levels, inventory is accurately reported, improvement in cash flow and revenue collection, which of course you can add more. And with disadvantage, okay, what are we talking about? With disadvantage of ERP, you're talking about things like it is perceived as difficult and expensive to implement. Okay, of course, there are also hidden costs which can be high. Now, let's move on to just in time. Okay, remember, this is a third learning outcome. So we're just looking at techniques that can be used to manage what? To manage inventory. So just in time is a production and inventory management system that was pioneered by Toyota. So this is a production philosophy whereby what is needed is made when it's needed and not before. Okay? So the JIT, that is the just in time, can be summarized by the following 5 zeros. Okay? The 5 zeros. Which are these? 0 defects, 0 setup times, 0 inventories, 0 handling, 0 lead time. And it's one thing to know that, it's also something else to know how those works in practice, which is, again, your end, okay? Which is something you need to know. For example, when you talk about 0 inventories, the idea is we don't want to waste, storage space. We don't want to just hold on to stock. So we just get stock when we need it, okay? Because it's going to be used in the production process. So it's not holding cost. We are not incurring costs in terms of holding those stocks and things of that nature. Right, let's move on to the next one, which is lean. So the idea behind this inventory control, okay, the lean inventory control technique is driving value and eliminating defects of waste in a production line and in service industry flows. So waste in this case refers to anything that does not add value to the product. So the pioneer of this concept, Taiichi Ohno of Toyota, identified 7 key types of waste. And what exactly are these? So in this case, we're talking about defects, okay? There is fault and mistake that will require correcting. Inventory, basically holding too much of these will lead to increased storage cost. Movement, the kind of people's activity and movement that doesn't contribute to what is being produced. Waiting, in this case, it's machinery and even people that remain idle while waiting for parts to be delivered or upstream processes to be completed. Number 5, overproducing. In this case, producing more than what is needed. And then we have overprocessing, that is a necessary process of production. And then transportation, any unnecessary movement of machinery and parts of vehicle. The point with lean, okay, the point with this lean technique is to do more with less, okay? Less of what? Less human effort, less equipment, less time, and less space, while ensuring that you provide customers with what they want. Now, there are 5 principles. There are 5 principles that are guiding when it comes to the lean technique. And these 5 principles are, so the first principle of lean is to identify and define value from a customer's perspective. When you talk about value, you're looking at it from a customer's point of view. Remember something like this video, you may think, okay, this video is good, and that's just me talking. But I'm not the one, you are, in this case, you're the user, okay? You're the one who can look at it and say, or can go through it and say, okay, this was helpful, or this was a complete wastage of time, which I hope it isn't. So that's the thing with value. You look at it from the customer's point of view. And meaning, if you are making bicycles, then value could be high quality, safe, durability, reliable, things of that nature. Number 2, identify the value system. So specify value as number 1. Number 2 is to identify the value system. This involves mapping out the entire value system, that is, the sequence of activities and process required to deliver the value. So this will call for 3 critical management tasks. Number 1, problem-solving tasks, things like design and engineering sketches. Number 2, information management, okay, things like taking orders and scheduling deliveries. Number 3, physical transformation tasks, basically turning raw materials into finished products in the hands of the customers. So in a bicycle manufacturing, value stream include everything from sourcing raw materials like metal for the frames, rubber for the tires, to assembling components, okay, painting, quality control, shipping, all that stuff is part of the value system or the value stream. Number 3, the third thing that you need or that principle of lean is flow. Once value has been specified and the value stream for a specific product mapped by the lean enterprise and wasteful steps eliminated, the next step is to make the remaining value creating steps flow. And then number 4, we have the pool, which is the 4th principle. And this is about implementing a pool-based system where production is based on actual customer demand. So in our bicycle manufacturing business, this will mean producing bicycles only when orders are received, rather than producing a large number of bicycles and hoping they will be sold. Why are we doing this? Okay, the point with this is to reduce, first of all, it's going to help us to reduce holding on to a lot of inventories which people probably don't need. All right, so that is the pool. Okay, and the 5th principle is continuous improvement. Right, so this could be improving process, reducing defects, enhancing cycle times, finding ways to optimize resource utilization. So in our example, again, our bicycle manufacturing business, we could regularly gather feedback, okay, from customers and identify areas for improvement, and production team could work on refining their assembly processes to make them more efficient. So 5 principles of lean. Right, so at this point is what I want you to do, okay? I want you to give advantages and disadvantages of the lean method. Again, remember, it's learning by doing, man. So just watch the video and then be like, yeah, I'm good. Try these things, okay? Answer those questions. Of course, again, as I said, if you need more practice exercises, if you need more computer-based exams, link in the video description. Okay, will take you to, or just go to zeritnetwork.com, but the link in the video description is going to be faster. Access these questions, practice them. Obviously, if you have any question, ask, whether it's via email or whichever way, just ask. Okay, so that is actually the end of part 2, okay, of our level 4 module 7. The idea here was to understand the key elements of effective inventory control, and that meant understanding 3 things, so the 3 learning outcomes that are presented at this stage. And these were, first, you had to differentiate between the different classification of inventory, after which you had to identify the direct and indirect cost of holding inventory, and finally you should be in a position to identify techniques associated with inventory control. So remember, in the video description I've also added a link to part 1, okay, the first part, because remember there are 3 parts to this learning module, okay, so you can check that one out too. If you haven't, if you have, good. If you haven't subscribed, kindly do, okay, and I'll see you in the next video.